In ancient Rome, the roar of the Colosseum didn't end when the fighting stopped. For the gladiators who walked out of the arena alive, victory came with privileges, terrifying privileges that fell hardest on the people with the least power. Because in Rome, fame was a weapon, and the first victims were often the enslaved women assigned to them. Before we proceed, let me know from which part of the world you are watching this video. Your perspective shapes how these forgotten histories come alive. The truth is this: once the crowd dispersed and the sand settled, the arena's heroes returned not to freedom, but to barracks controlled by trainers, lannistae, and slave owners. And in those same barracks were women who had no say in where they lived, who controlled them, or what their futures held. Female slaves were placed into this world not because they chose it, but because Roman society viewed them as property objects to be assigned, transferred, punished, or rewarded. The relationship between gladiators and these enslaved women wasn't some romantic fantasy shown in modern films. It was a hierarchy built on power, fear, and dominance. A hierarchy where a woman's safety depended entirely on the temperament of the men around her, where survival meant understanding the moods of fighters hardened by near-death struggles and constant brutality. Ancient records show that female slaves were distributed among gladiator schools for labor cleaning, tending to wounds, preparing gear, and working in service rooms attached to the barracks. But the darkest reality was unofficial, rarely written down, yet widely acknowledged in the descriptions left by Roman writers, satirists, and moralists. Gladiators, whether adored or feared, held absolute control over the enslaved people within their reach. These women lived in a world where every sound from the arena screamed, a cheer, a death echoed into their nights. They knew that a victorious gladiator returned with adrenaline still burning through him, nerves still tense, mind still wired from killing or almost being killed. And these emotions didn't disappear when he left the arena. They spilled outward into the spaces where enslaved women worked, slept, and tried to remain unnoticed. But remaining invisible was nearly impossible. Winning gladiators were celebrated like modern celebrities. Their fame meant access, attention, and dangerous entitlement. And the enslaved women connected to them, willingly or not, were swept into the shadow. They had no legal protection, no voice, no recourse. A slave could not accuse, could not refuse, could not hide. Roman law made that clear. Some gladiators treated these women as attendants, others treated them as markers of status. A woman might be assigned to a single fighter, or she might be moved around depending on who held authority that week. She might serve in medical quarters one day and be forced to wait on an arena celebrity the next. Her life could be reshaped overnight by a trainer's decision, a gambler's debt, or a Lanista's deal. And because gladiators lived with death as a daily companion, many formed intense, unpredictable attachments. Some became possessive, some became paranoid, some, scarred by violence, turned their trauma outward. A woman trapped in this environment walked on a shifting floor of danger, never knowing what each night would bring or how quickly power could turn against her. But the worst fate for many wasn't the violence of a single gladiator, it was the institution itself. Gladiator schools were controlled like military camps combined with prisons. Strict discipline, harsh punishments, and absolute authority ruled every part of daily life. Enslaved women could be punished for disobedience, for mistakes, for provoking the fighter's anger, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Punishments ranged from forced labor to public humiliation inside the barracks. Some were chained during certain hours with no explanation. Others were kept in isolation as correction. And then there were the arena nights, the celebrations after victories, where crowds outside drank, shouted, and demanded the next day's heroics. Inside the barracks, those same nights often became the most terrifying for enslaved women. A victorious fighter was a valuable asset, and trainers would reward their champions however they saw fit. These rewards often came at the expense of the women who had no power to resist. Many enslaved women recorded nothing of their experiences because literacy was rare, and even when they could write, their words were not preserved. Their lives existed between the lines of Roman texts written by men of status, senators, philosophers, poets who mentioned them only in passing, usually as warnings, jokes, or symbols of Rome's decadence. Yet tiny fragments survive. A letter written by a Roman matron complains that her husband keeps a gladiator, as girl in the stables. Another account describes a woman who tried to flee a gladiator school and was punished for interfering with a fighter's property. Archaeological digs at gladiator barracks have uncovered women's jewelry, hairpins, and textile remains in areas explicitly restricted to enslaved labor as strong evidence of their forced presence. These fragments don't give us every detail, but they reveal enough to understand the truth. For female slaves, a gladiator's victory was never a celebration. It was a shift in power that could tighten their chains. With each win, their world became more unpredictable, their future more uncertain, their safety more fragile. Because in ancient Rome, the arena didn't just consume the blood of men, it consumed the lives of women, whose suffering was never meant to be recorded, never meant to be remembered, and never meant to be told. What followed after the arena was not freedom, not rest, not glory, but a new kind of captivity. The moment the gates closed behind the victorious gladiators, the same crowds who just roared for spilled blood vanished, and a silence settled over the underground barracks that felt heavier than the sand of the arena itself. Down in the dim corridors of the lettuce, the enslaved women assigned to the fighters were already waiting, arranged, inspected, and positioned by the Lanista as guards, as if they were pieces of equipment, another part of the gladiator-esque reward system. They existed in a world where every door was locked from the outside, every hour was scheduled, and every breath was something they didn't own. The women lived with the knowledge that the men they served were powerful only inside the arena. But inside the barracks, they were still slaves, and slaves could be punished for anything: hesitation, defiance, silence, eye contact, or even breathing at the wrong moment. Guards enforced order with iron rods, and any woman who faltered risked being dragged into the courtyard where discipline was public and humiliating. The gladiators themselves were unpredictable. Some were violent because violence was all they had ever known. Some were cold and detached, still trembling with rage and adrenaline from the fight. Others simply accepted the system, following its rules the way they followed the rhythm of combat, without question, without pause, without mercy. The women often feared the quiet ones most, the fighters who never spoke, never shouted, never reacted, their minds fractured by years of killing for entertainment. You never knew when a man like that might explode, and when he did, no guard interfered. The Lanista considered these eruptions training release, something that kept the fighters sharp for their next bout. The women performed endless labor, hauling heavy amphorae of water, scrubbing blood-soaked sand from shields, cleaning the barracks after every training session, binding wounds when Medici were unavailable, cataloging gear, and preparing armor repairs. Their hands blistered, their backs bent, their ears ringing from constant shouting. They were forced to stand beside the training yard each morning, listening to the sound of wooden swords smashing against bodies, to the thud of bodies hitting dust, to the violent bellowing of instructors demanding more blood, more effort, more pain. But it wasn't the physical toil that broke them. It was the psychological erosion that came from living so close to an unending cycle of violence. Every day they witnessed men beaten into shapes that Rome admired. Every day they heard bets placed on who would live and who would die. Every day they watched the fighters practice killing moves on dummies shaped like people, sometimes whispering the names of fallen opponents under their breath. The line between training and brutality blurred, until the women felt as though they lived inside a machine designed to crush the human spirit. The Lanista controlled every aspect of their existence. He tracked their movements, restricted their speech, monitored their behavior, and conditioned them through reward and punishment the same way he conditioned the fighters. He insisted that discipline in the barracks leads to discipline in the arena, and that philosophy extended to everyone trapped within its walls. If a woman disobeyed, she was punished in front of the gladiators. a reminder to the men that authority flowed downward from the top, not upward from the arena floor. But the women also saw what the public never did: the gladiators' own suffering. They watched men collapse after training, coughing out blood. They heard them cry out in their sleep, haunted by battles they had won but never survived emotionally. They saw the scars layered over scar tissue, and the way some fighters stared at the ground for hours after a kill, unable to wash the memory from their minds. Fame didn't protect them. Skill didn't protect them. Not even victory protected them. A gladiator could become a legend in the arena and a forgotten corpse in the barracks the next day. And the women had to clean the aftermath. They scrubbed blood from the floors. They stripped armor from bodies that would never breathe again. They helped carry fallen fighters to the cremation pits, ash clinging to their skin, knowing that the next man to die might be someone they'd fed, bandaged, or worked beside only hours earlier. They live in a world where death was routine and grief was forbidden. Any sign of sadness was punished, because sadness was considered weakness, and Rome was contagious. The women were trapped in the middle of two forms of power: the physical dominance of gladiators and the institutional dominance of the Roman system. They could not run. They could not fight back. They could not appeal to law, because legally, they weren't people, they were property. Their lives were determined by contracts they never signed, chains they never chose, and battles they never fought. Yet sometimes, against every rule, small rebellions took root. A woman might slip food to an injured fighter after hours. She might whisper a warning when guards were approaching. She might stitch messages into bandages or hide tools beneath armor plates. These acts were tiny, almost invisible, but in a place where everything was controlled, anything done by choice felt like a triumph. Some women formed bonds with certain fighters, not romantic but human, to slaves caught in the same crushing machine, recognizing the same suffering in each other. In those moments, the barracks felt less like a prison and more like a place where broken people tried to keep each other alive. They shared stories of the outside world, tales of families lost and futures stolen. They reminded each other that they had names before Rome erased them. But those moments never lasted long. Punishments came suddenly, violently, without warning. A single mistake could lead to days of confinement in the storage pits, dark, airless rooms where time disappeared. A rumor of disloyalty could lead to public flogging. A complaint overheard by the wrong person could end in forced labor that broke bones and spirits. The women learned to speak without sound, to move without being seen, to breathe without drawing attention, and through it all, the Colosseum loomed above them, a reminder that the world worshipped the suffering that destroyed them. Rome celebrated strength, but inside the Ludus, Rome created its own victims. Men and women alike were swallowed by a system that cared only for spectacle. When a fighter entered the arena, the crowd erupted with joy. When a woman entered the barracks, no one cared if she ever came out again. And that was the truth Rome never showed the world. Behind every victorious gladiator stood enslaved women who lived in constant fear, constant danger, and constant invisibility. Prisoners of an empire that saw their suffering as just another part of the entertainment industry. Their stories were never written in scrolls. Their names were never carved into stone. Their pain was never acknowledged in public debates. But inside the barracks, in whispered conversations during the quietest hours of the night, they kept their memories alive. They reminded each other that before Rome turned them into shadows, they were daughters, sisters, wives, workers, travelers, dreamers. And even though the empire tried to erase them, their stories survive in fragments. Broken pieces of lives crushed by the same civilization that built monuments to glory. This is the chapter of Roman history the world forgets. The one where victory and violence were intertwined. Where slaves carried the weight of an empire's hunger for spectacle. And where survival itself became an act of rebellion. If you're still watching, make sure you comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It helps this channel grow and keeps these forgotten histories alive.